Hello, my name is Edith, and I'm the Societies Coordinator on the Multicultural Week Committee. And welcome to today's episode of Dialogue with the Departments. Dialogue with the Departments is a series of interviews with different faculty members of the University of St Andrews, where we discuss multiculturalism, the barriers of diversity faced in academia. And today we're so thrilled to have Dr. Akira O'Connor to join us from the Psychology Department. Dr. O'Connor, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, thank you for accepting our invitation to invite you to join us for this interview. I'm sorry, a bit nervous right now. Could you please introduce yourself quickly to some of our audience who might not know you?
Yeah, so as you've said, I'm Akira O'Connor. As you can probably tell from my name, I'm half Japanese, half Irish. I grew up in northwest London. I was state educated in northwest London, and have spent time in the north of England, the Midwest of the USA, and then now St Andrews in Scotland. I've wrestled with the mixed race experience in ways that I'm sure many who watch this who are mixed race will have wrestled with it too. I never really felt part of either of my parents' communities. I never felt British either, given that neither of my parents was British. I was definitely a Londoner, and that was a kind of an experience that kind of stuck with me throughout my youth, and I guess it's also that experience of multiculturalism that is really that has stuck with me through to my time now. But I guess my experience as a mixed race person really began to solidify actually in St Andrews when I had children myself who are mixed race. When I read literature and experienced more kind of media from accounts of other people who are BAME and mixed race that actually spoke to me and that I felt included me in the kind of BAME voice. So that's something that I've drawn strength from, and it's something I would also look to impart to students who might be looking to kind of better understand their own identities.
That's very lovely, and yeah, that is a great perspective. So, are you ready for the interview itself?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess let's get started. What is your take on the current conversations around diversity within curriculum and members of faculties in academia, universities around the world?
I think these are conversations that I mean, I think this is a really obvious answer. But I'm going to expand on it. I think they're absolutely vital, these conversations. I also think they're really very important to have in the right sort of way. I think there are ways of doing this in terms of diversifying and decolonizing curricula that pay lip service to that process without actually engaging in that fully. So by paying lip service to it, I mean including some authors on a reading list that deviates slightly from the canon, whether it's because of their gender or because of their race, or choosing to suggest to people that there may be other ways of looking at things, but this is the canon that we're teaching, and this is therefore the most important thing to do. I think that only goes part of the way towards understanding what we should be doing when we think about diversifying or decolonizing a curriculum. I think the kind of complete way of doing that is to understand what the canon is, why the canon is what it is, and how it has kind of perpetuated itself to the exclusion of the groups, the peoples that feel excluded and that are excluded by that canon. I think a lot of the time there are systems of thought that have been entrenched in the canon that need to be critically interrogated. So we don't just need to look at the canon as the most important body of work. I think we also need to look at it as a system that entrenches that way of thinking. So yeah, I think it's really positive that many universities, most universities I would say, are engaging with this sort of process. I think in order for it to be done in the way that I think is maximally beneficial to ways of thinking, to people in society, I think it needs to be more than just broadening a reading list.
That's a great response. So moving on to the next question, we also acknowledge that these are not, well, new conversations. Do you think that becoming the mainstream public narrative will impact or has already impacted the timeline of change in terms of multiculturalism in academia and universities?
Yeah, so when I was thinking about this question, I was kind of conflicted about how I wanted to respond to this, because on the one hand, of course, I think it's really positive that more people are talking about this, because that means that it's going to have a broader reach in society. You know, if it's not just academics in their ivory towers talking about it, but it's people on the street of Bristol, you know, people in cities across the world protesting and using that kind of their enthusiasm and their anger and their tiredness to motivate change across the whole of society, then I think that has to accelerate change. It has to accelerate change. But I think the reason I had a kind of conflict in my thought about it was what it also does, I think, is it in making those ideas mainstream, it allows a kind of a counterculture argument to solidify very, very quickly. So, for example, if you look at the number of complaints that TV channels receive when they air footage or they show people who are supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, you see this kind of resistance to this argument that has also become part of the mainstream. And I think whereas previously we might have been able to kind of softly chip away at the system and almost do that covertly, I think now that is having to be done in the context of public and political scrutiny, where there are more, I guess, traditional, conservative, imperial forces at play that are resistant to that change. Now, if you have to set those two against each other, I would rather change that is faster, that is scrutinized, and that forces people to defend why this needs to happen. I think that's important in terms of transparency, in terms of people understanding why this change needs to be made, and also in terms of dismantling the systems that are actually affecting people's lives here and now. So yes, faster change is important, but it doesn't always make for the most comfortable change. But I think, yeah, it will speed things up, but it introduces its own issues along the way.
Right, that's lovely. So moving away from the more public political sphere of stuff, what is your opinion on the decolonization of education or curriculum? And do you think it's possible to decolonize the psychology field in the first place?
Okay, what's my opinion on? Yeah, okay, so I think psychology is a field that kind of has partly wrestled with a lot of these ideas itself. So we've been aware for a couple of decades that we recruit from specific populations, specific kind of limited sections of the world and of society in, for example, our psychology experiments. So we look to make inference about all thought, all cognition, all psychology, yet if we're only recruiting from a certain subset of the world, of society, then those inferences are going to be restricted, faulty, unreliable. And so there has been a kind of an attempt to deal with that to some extent within psychology. I think trickier issues that we need to deal with as part of decolonizing the psychology and the neuroscience curriculum are to do with the seats of power in terms of those who influence thought. We are used to thinking of the West and the global North as being the kind of powerhouses of thought, and that's undoubtedly reflected in the papers we teach, in the ideas and the theories and their origins. And to some extent, I think we need to start examining that too, why we do that, and what it is about those ways of thinking that are appealing, and what it is about other ways of thinking that haven't necessarily caught on. If it's just the case that that's where money is invested in research, then we need to do something about that too, because that's a system that is kind of systematically disempowering people in the communities that are not blessed with that kind of privilege. So yeah, psychology and neuroscience, I think, needs to examine itself in ways that are more critical, perhaps, than we are used to doing that in. I also think that as we get towards the kind of the more kind of the wet science, the bench science end of psychology and neuroscience, we get towards a slightly more entrenched view of the canon being kind of unarguable, that this is not a matter of subjectivity, this is a matter of objective truth. And I think those sorts of arguments also need very critical thought. A lot of the time, for example, in a subject I teach to my second year students, statistics, you would think, statistics and mathematics would be a relatively objective field. Yet some of the thinkers that have been most influential in those fields have used their undoubtedly brilliant statistics to make some undoubtedly abhorrent claims and campaigns for the change of society that we would consider utterly detrimental, disgusting. So I think, again, turning ourselves critically to what we consider the canon and how that canon has been used is also a really, really essential aspect of what we need to be doing in psychology and neuroscience.
Right, that is a great response. So you talked a lot about how the West and Global North being the dominant narrative in the field of psychology. So let's move this on to a more SAMCW level of stuff. Like, do you think these practices, these thoughts are specific, especially revealing in such a traditional university, or do you think we've actually done some things to move away from this traditional narrative that is still very subjective to a degree?
I think St Andrews is attempting to do what it can, and it's at the beginning of that journey. I think the way in which the principal and the appointees she has made to her senior management team that kind of prioritize diversity, I think they're absolutely moving in the right direction. Do I think it's more of a problem at St Andrews than at other universities? At this stage, yes, I do. I think there are some things to do with St Andrews that make it somewhat challenging an environment to really promote diversity in from the baseline we're at. And one of those, I think, is that we're not in a city. We're not close to a kind of diverse centre of kind of population mass. I think it's easier for in Glasgow, in Manchester, in London, and Birmingham. But I think that's something that we need to be addressing in how we deal with what we deal with. I think there are some kind of additional tensions within St Andrews that we need to think very carefully about as well. If we want to encourage students and staff from more diverse backgrounds, I think we need to consider some of the traditions and practices that could be viewed as exclusionary. I think publicity material that emphasizes historic practices often emphasizes to certain groups of students, BAME students, for example, or students from different class backgrounds to those we are used to, those we are used to teaching, that they might not fit in here. And I think that is probably something that students who arrive here realize is not the case. But in terms of outward-facing material, I think it's really important to consider things like red gowns. There are other things to do with the recruitment of staff that I could talk a great deal about. I think without a kind of critical mass of BAME staff already, it becomes very difficult to suggest to new staff that their cultures are going to be represented, that they are going to find community here in St Andrews. And I think that's something that the university needs to consider as well, how to encourage and promote kind of networks of that will make staff feel comfortable and at home when there isn't that critical mass of BAME staff already.
Right, that is lovely indeed. And moving on, what are the kind of steps you have or would like to have personally changed to adapt your teaching practices to cater for students of varying backgrounds and beliefs in psychology?
Well, so I think a lot of schools in the university are engaging in curriculum reviews focused on diversity. I think those are only going to be helpful to the conversation. I think for kind of maximal buy-in to that process, staff need to be fully engaged in a way that is perhaps difficult but not alienating. I think it's a challenging prospect to review a curriculum and point out to a teacher that the images they use are not as diverse as they should be. And that's a challenging thing to hear. That's a thing that that's the thing that I think we need to look at ourselves. By that I don't mean that we shouldn't hear that from other people, but I mean we should be encouraged to look at that ourselves as well, in order that we can make those sorts of changes, in terms of very superficial changes, like who we're choosing to represent in the images, how we are choosing to represent certain groups in the images we have chosen. There are other things that, I've hinted at in some of my other answers, which is being more critical in our teaching of the canon, understanding why this body of work that we have chosen to best represent, let's say, psychology at first or second year level, or statistics at first or second year level, is the body of work that it is, and why the people we view as influential are the people that we have settled on. I think those kinds of ideas are difficult too, and I think those ideas are perhaps ones where there are the biggest barriers, because as soon as we start moving away from the canon, we start moving away from those things we ourselves have been taught as teachers. We start having to kind of redefine things for ourselves in ways that create new narratives. And I think that's another thing about the canon that is comforting to people, is that everyone knows the narrative within whatever domain of psychology or broader discipline. If you've been to university, as almost all of our lecturers have, and then you teach this stuff, it's something you have a kind of almost like a fairy tale knowledge of. So deviating from that is difficult. It requires sometimes making some mistakes in figuring out how best to teach something. And I think sometimes there isn't that much freedom to do that. That can be quite a difficult process. But I think it can also be a really gratifying process if you settle on a new narrative that is more in line with the values that you're keen to see represented in your work.
That's lovely. So we've talked so much about the teaching staff's approaches and methods they use to diversify the academic field. Is there anything you think you would love to see the student body do to diversify the curriculum and the university itself?
Oh, that's nice. A nice question. I think, well, so my experiences of teaching material that is kind of diversified, I guess, or that represents a view of the canon that is slightly more critical and more aware of its kind of part in shaping society, has been positive. And by that I mean, a lot of the time we worry that students might be disappointed that we are choosing to tackle kind of really weighty societal issues when students might want to just learn about, for example, statistics. But I think my experience of that has been that students are very ready to hear about those critical issues that kind of embed themselves into those disciplines and those teachings. So one of the things that I think is really important is to continue that kind of that desire to learn in a way that is not just learning to a test, or that is not just about what is going to make me kind of employable as someone with the University of St. Andrews degree, but to kind of take pride in those kind of systems of understanding that recognize the kind of cultural background of what you've learned and the cultural power of that to potentially change society. Other things are the kind of standard things that I think are really important to do with how students engage with each other and with people from other cultures. Now, I think within St Andrews we're pretty good. We have pretty good ways in which we engage with people from our own home nations and other nations, because we're such a broad international community. But I think there are still, I don't know, there are ways in which those interactions can be made slightly less alienating for people. I've been asked by a student, "What are you?" When it turns out they were asking, what's my background? Not even where am I from? Where are my parents from? Because they weren't happy with London as the answer. And I think there are, perhaps this is just the way in which society is changing. I hope that is going to happen less and less. But I think there are certain ways in which we can engage and recognize the value of each other's culture that kind of moves beyond I know British culture as the canon, the canonical culture, and everything else being something that needs to be interrogated for its validity.
That's lovely. So you kind of talked about your own perception of your own identity a bit just now, and I'm just wondering, how do you think your identity has shaped or impacted your experience in academia or as a teacher, and how has it ever impacted your experience here in return?
Yeah, my experience, I've experienced racism growing up. I experienced a lot of it when I was at university in Leeds. Actually, I was attacked on a bus for not laughing at racist jokes. I've never experienced anything so overt as that in St Andrews in Fife. I carry those experiences with me, which means that I respond in ways that are perhaps might mark me out as sensitive or as someone with a chip on their shoulder when I feel criticism that resembles that kind of abuse that I have experienced. I mean, these are difficult conversations because they're kind of, I feel they're very, everyone has their own experience of difficulty, and mine haven't been particularly hard, but they have been very influential in terms of how I think. I think some ways in which they've impacted that are kind of subtle but very very influential for me have been, for example, dealing with racism that my son has experienced at school. Having a meeting with the head teacher at school about this and being told that they take all bad language very seriously at school, as if as if racism is just a problem of bad language, and that there is no further problem that needs to be addressed in that. I think those kind of issues are somewhat problematic, and to give the university credit, I think the university is moving away from what might have been a historic position like that to a position that seeks to deal with race in and of itself as a problem that presents its own difficulties and its own challenges and disadvantages people in ways that are quite unique. So yeah, has it affected my teaching? I mean, I think yes, it has in subtle ways. It also means that I've been keen to absorb conversations on diversifying curricula, decolonizing the curriculum, because I recognise that a lot of those sorts of conversations, if they had been had earlier in society, would have prevented these things from happening to me and my family. So yeah, it has influenced my outlook. It's certainly influenced my what I choose to teach in various ways. Yeah, these things have been hugely influential on me as a person.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, and I'm really sorry to hear the instance with back in university and with your son. Yeah, I wasn't really expecting. I mean, I guess I was expecting to a degree that everyday racism is still a thing in this day and age, but just not quite as overtly and as ignorantly as it was handled. So, being a mixed-race lecturer at SAMCW yourself, would you say you have any advice for students who come from similar backgrounds to yourself?
Yeah, this is something that I'm really envious of many students at university now, because I think I started my undergraduate degree I think 20 years ago last week. So it was kind of a generation ago, you know, that I was in the position that students are in now. And I remember being told by some friends, and also hearing conversations amongst friends about me, that you shouldn't talk to Akira about race because it's like walking on eggshells with him. That I was angry about some of the conversations that people were having around race, and that I was quick to express my anger about that. In the context of the conversations we're having today, that what I was expressing was mild, but it was different times, and people were uncomfortable with the way in which I was, in a very small way, trying to challenge what they were saying about race. As a result, I mean, the whole reason I'm saying that is that those sorts of conversations, when you hear them about yourself, they change you, and they made me hide and speak less about those things. And so I didn't really have the experience of participating in conversations about race too much by choice, because I found that too uncomfortable. So I'm really envious of students now who have the opportunity to embrace that. I mean, I remember finding community, and this was online, finding an online mixed race community when I was working in the US, and feeling like my world had changed, that there's something revelatory about finding a group of people who had similar experiences to those that I had. And I'm so envious of young people who can grow up with that, and who can take comfort in the advice and the experiences of those people around them who are in similar positions. So I'm certainly not one to be giving advice other than to say that just lap it up, you know, enjoy and revel in the experiences of those around you, and that's not just good, you know, good and bad. Provide solidarity for each other, be listening posts for each other, and kind of revel in each other's experiences, because I think you'll take huge strength from that.
Right, that is lovely. So let's move the conversation to a more current issue. So with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, what kind of changes should students be expecting within teaching processes, especially for students who have to learn from home in all the other countries that are, well, not in the UK?
Yeah, so I think we're reaching a point where governments and universities are having to make decisions about teaching that are difficult because they impact the bottom line of the country's finances and university finances. I think there has been a reluctance to move to online only teaching because universities and many, yeah, well, because universities make money from accommodation. I think that's something of a conflict of interests if that is set against the need to keep everyone as socially distant as possible, because we've got these areas of relatively high density living that are kind of that are not great in terms of disease transmission. So as far as what people can expect, I mean, I think if we were to apply the same rules that governments would have us obey in other situations, then we would move to a, where at all possible, stay-at-home model, and that therefore means, in my view, an online-only model. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad model. It depends on the discipline. So there are some disciplines where that might be more difficult than in others. But I think the teachers I've spoken to at university who have embraced the kind of online modality of delivering their teaching have put a huge amount of thought into this. I think in terms of the amount of time that you as students are getting from lecturers, whether that's contact time or time that is put into thinking about teaching and how one might deliver it best, I think we're probably at an all-time high right now in terms of how much teachers have thought about how they're going to deliver their teaching. So I think that bodes well for online teaching. It's different, and again, that might not sit well within the context of organizations that pride themselves on tradition, where tradition might be small group face-to-face teaching. But in the context of global pandemic, I think just like in other conversations we've had so far, we've talked about examining things critically, and I think that there are similar ways of critically interrogating what we need to do that we need to engage in right now.
Right, that's a fantastic answer, and I'm sure like a lot of students will find some comfort to like your understanding of how online teaching has impacted like the teaching process and learning process in general at St. Andrews. So yeah, thank you so very much for joining us today for this interview, and really love your answers. Is there any final words you'd like to say like before we end this interview to students who are watching this video?
No, I mean, beyond thanking you for having me on and also for kind of facilitating this sort of conversation and this sort of this sort of way of disseminating stuff to people who might be who might find some of this interesting. I really appreciate what you're doing. Like I said, when I discovered that there were people with similar experiences to mine who were speaking to me and speaking to my own experiences, I took a huge amount of strength from that. So I see what you're doing is exactly the same thing, and I really appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we are mostly driven on the idea that we want to go beyond just checking the boxes, like promoting the cultural side of multiculturalism. We're hoping to confront the maybe like slightly more uncomfortable sides of this ideology in a way. And yeah, hopefully students will find this interview and everything that you've said comforting, and like you said, find strength through the advice that you've given them. So yeah, that's been today's dialogue with the department, and until next time, we'll see you soon.